Hi, in this video we're going to be going over the bake constraint mode inside of QOOBIT Sequence Baker. To get started, make sure that we are in the bake mode inside of the widget, and we'll see at the top there's the bake options for the constraints. Similar to the other sections, we also have the auto update from sequencer selection, so that when we change different selections inside the sequencer, the widget will also update in sync as well. On top of that, we have this autofocus feature, so that when we create nulls, when we are using this widget, the viewport will automatically focus to the nulls so that we're not looking for things all over the place inside of the viewport. On top of that, we have this default option, which is browse to constraints after creation. So whenever you are using this widget and you do create a new constraint, you will be browsing over to the constraints tab here to list the all current constraints. As a good habit, we generally keep constraints inside of the animation tab to all, just to make sure that we don't have any orphans or any rogue constraints running, but you can change it to default selected if you do wish to do so. Generally, we're going to keep this in all for the purpose of this demo. On top of that, we also have the ability to auto delete constraints after we bake with this widget, and also to delete the nulls after each bake. On top of that, we also have the key settings that we can set. We're going to be setting this to all frames because generally when we do work with constraints, we do want all keys to be baked down across all the frames when we are working with constraints. And the frame increment just says how many frames we should be generating keys for. So generally one would be every frame, you would be generating a new key when you are baking down. And we're generally going to be leaving the reduced keys alone. So similar to the constraints up here, we have the ability to choose the type of constraint we want to work with, whether we want to maintain offset or not, and we can choose from the list of options here. If we are using the look at, you also have the ability to choose the axis you want to use for your look at. And we have these macros at the bottom to allow you to quickly switch between different axes, so you don't have to manually type them in or use the spin box here. So we're just going to leave that at Y for the later examples. And down here, we also have the ability to set our different constraint parameters. So whether or not we want to start at the current frame, which is the playhead, to start the constraint, or we want to designate a specific frame that we wish to constrain to. So on top of that, we can also use our marked frames. So if you are creating marked frames or using one of the special frames, you can pick one of these guys to fill in the frame number automatically. So in this example, we're just going to be using 0 as the start frame for most of our constraint cases. You do also have the option to leave the end unconstrained or pin down the frame you wish the constraint to end. Also in this example, we're just going to leave the end unconstrained so that we don't have a constraint all of a sudden end halfway at a specific frame. All right, so to get started, we're just going to be creating a null. So nulls is just a custom actor that we've created as part of this plugin. So you don't have to be necessarily working with another object, and you have something that you can reference in world space as a transform parameter. So for example, if we add a null here, it adds a null as a spawnable track to the origin by default. If you do want to add a contextual null, you do have the option to select different things in the viewport or in the sequencer or even in the widget to spawn a null in a different context. So for example, if we want to spawn a null here, we can select the control here and press the plus button, and we'll get a null at this current frame, which is 44. And you can see that it's at this exact pose right here. If we scrub around, it's going to be pinned to that frame because we only have details regarding that frame. And if we look at our spawnable track, we do have a transform key that was formed in 44 on the frame that it was created on. If you do want to delete the null, you can delete the null here. If you are creating a null in a specific context, you will also see the naming of the null. So we can see that it's a named null that was created on the hand RFK control, and it's for skmany. You can also click the edit button or press F2 to rename the null, or you can even rotate the null here, as you can see here. And the rotation will happen in the local space here as well. So you can get out of gimbal locks, which we will show later on in this example. All right, so now that we have a null, we can also just move it if we wanted to move it. But to use the nulls and constraints, we can do different things. So for example, if we want to use a parent constraint as an example, let's just create the null again. So let's go to this random frame. We're going to create a null here. Oops, I'm going to create a null on the hand as an example. And you can see the autofocus also working as well. Because we have autofocus on, it will bounce directly to the null here. So let's add a parent constraint for the purpose of a demo. We're going to go add constraint. And we're going to need to pick another object here. So we picked a null, and we're going to try to do a parent constraint to the hand. So now that we've selected the hand, you can see that the constraint hasn't actually automatically applied. Because a lot of time when you're working with constraints, you start to be uncertain of which one should be the child or the parent. We've kind of shifted this decision to the last step so that we did select a null, and then we did select the control for the hand. And at this point, you can decide which direction you want to do the constraint on. So you can see here, we can go from the null to the hand, or from the hand to the null. So if we want to do, for example, from the hand to the null, we can click this one, and it'll apply the constraint from the hand to the null. So now that the constraint has been applied with the maintain offset, we can now move the hand with the null. And if we wanted to, we can also delete the constraint or delete the null or both together. So you can see here we have this constraint and we have been bounced to the constraints tab because we did check off browse to constraint after creation. So I'm going to uncheck this for the remainder of this demo, but just be aware you are able to keep this on if you do wish to use this in the future. So now that we are back in the nulls, we can choose to delete our nulls, which will cascade and delete our constraints on there as well. So if we delete that, you can see that it bounces back and we have the constraints removed as well as the null removed. All right, so now that we have a simple way to work with different constraints, we can look at some of the different ways we can use some of our macros here to do some more advanced examples. So in one case, similar to how we just did it, rather than creating a null, doing the constraints manually each time, we'll take a look at our first macro here. So we can go here and we can go world space parent constraint null on select controls. So what this does is now that we have selected this macro, we now have a null that is baked down to all frames, and it follows the control all the way throughout the bake range. On top of that, we have the constraint set up similar to how we had it in the example earlier, and it's got the maintain offset off so that we have the null in world space and we're able to manipulate the control in world space rather than using the local space directly with the control. Cool. So on top of this, if you are using the curve editor, which we'll reveal here really quickly, there are cases where you do get into gimbal locks or undesired scenarios. So for example, let's take a look at the rotation here for our null here. So if you do get into cases where, let's say, you don't like the rotation of a specific setup, you can come in here, hit this rotation button, and then similar to how we did it earlier, we can also rotate the null in space. So you can see as we rotate in each axis, the curves are updating to reflect different workspaces for using the null. So if you are getting into situations where you see curves like this, where it's like going over a limit and coming back from the negative infinity, you can shift the space around using this to get into a better curve scenario that looks more close to something like this. All right, so this is a cool example of where you can actually rotate a null with both a constraint on and also without a constraint on. All right, so let's just delete this example and we'll take a look at a more advanced example with a pivot. So now let's take a look at our foot here. So let's select the foot. And we're going to use the right foot and we're going to go to frame 15. Or sorry, let's use the left foot here. All right, so with the left foot here, we can now create a null on the left foot on frame 15. And then we can also move this null to an arbitrary position that we want to use for our pivot. So let's say, let's move the null here. One sec, let me select it again. Let's move it to the heel. All right, so now that we have it roughly aligned at the heel, one sec, let me just change our zoom settings or our near clip frame settings. Let's just move the camera a bit. All right, now let's rotate this so that it's roughly where we want it on the heel. We can use the next macro here that we can show here, and we choose bake pivot to null offset. So if we choose this and then we choose our foot LIK control, you can see that we have a new constraint that is baked down with that null pinned at the heel. And it's got the parent constraint here as well. So now that we have the parent constraint here, we can choose the null and we can rotate that control that it's constrained to from this pivot instead. So this is really useful for doing cleanups. If you want to make sure the foot is in contact with the floor or at a specific rotation, you can pin a null to a specific spot arbitrarily and select a parent control and then set up this constraint setup here with a few clicks, and you have a constraint of a null that's in world space. And similarly, you can also turn on motion trails if you want, and you can see the motion trail of the null. And then you can use this in this space to clean up your curves if you wish to clean up in world space in a different setup. And similarly to what we did before, you can also rotate the nulls in this space as well if you don't like the curves. You can see that the motion trails are still preserved, but we have it in different spaces on the curve editor. All right, cool. So let's take a look at another example of the macro where we have set up for, let's say, a look at. So right now, if we have the head as an example, if we take a look at the control, we can see that the front direction of the head control is the positive y-axis. So one thing we can do, if we want to make a quick macro for a look at control, we can select the head control here, and then we can select our macro, and we can do an axis look at constraint, y-axis look at constraint on selected controls. So now that we've created that, we have a control here on a null that is constrained, and then we can do our look at here. And not only can we do this on one control, we can also do this on multiple controls. So let's say we select the head, and we search for, let's say, spine, and hold control. So we select both the head and the spine here. And then we click the same macro, plus y. So now we have two nulls, one for the spine, one for the head, and we can move them in different directions. And that's a really quick setup to get a look at constraint set up for both the spine and the head. So you can see this, rather than manually creating a null, doing the look at constraint manually, we have these macro setups in our menu here. That is pretty useful to have. By default, when you are working with the nulls, you might find that sometimes the nulls may be too small, or you might not want the nulls to be transparent all the time. So a couple ways you can work with the nulls rather than using the default settings is that you can change the null size on spawn. So if we repeat the similar example that we had just now, so we select the head and the spine using control, we can create the null with a different size. So what we can try to do now is we can change the size here to like something crazy like 7, and we create it with a plus or with the macro on the y-axis. You can see here that we have much bigger nulls. And if you are moving the nulls around and you want to resize them afterwards, if you go to the details panel, you will see here that we have this null size here. So you can choose to resize it down after you've created it if you don't like the size afterwards. So on top of that, you also have the ability to choose whether you want X-ray to be on or not. So what that means is, for example, right now, if we move this null through the floor, you can still see the null because it's running on a higher layer with a shader. If we uncheck this show as overlay, you will see that it becomes occluded by the floor now because it's running as a regular actor on a different shader layer that is being occluded. So normally by default, we have this show as overlay on, but if you want to see intersections, for example, between the floor, you might want to turn this off. You can see that you can have the null actor mesh here intersect and see when it leaves the floor and when it enters the floor. All right, so that's pretty much covers the nulls and how to work with the nulls in terms of sizing and stuff like that. And the last thing we want to cover is how do we bake this stuff down. So let's just do a simple animation. Let's say we move the nulls here, SM keys, and we're going to animate this thing here, and we're going to animate this other null here. Let's select the other null, and we're going to move it over here. Let's see, over here. So we have something that looks like this, where it's looking over here. And let's say we like how this looks. We can do a bake down with the widget. So rather than selecting each individual constraint, baking it down, we have the ability to bake either from the constraints by selecting this and using the bake button, or you can select the nulls and press the bake button. If you are baking down from the constraints tab, you will just be baking down the constraints and the nulls will be preserved. If you are baking down from the nulls tab, you do have the option of deleting the nulls after bake as well. So what we can do is, by default, we do have delete constraints and delete nulls after bake. So if we have them both selected and we hit the bake button, you'll see that, hey, all of our nulls are gone, but our animation for the look at is still there. And what's going on there is that that animation has now been baked down. You can see here that it is baked down to here on the two controls that we created the constraints on. All right, so that covers all of the basic features for the null constraint workflow that we have currently set up inside of our sequence baker. So for some more advanced workflows, we're going to be covering different videos down the line to cover different ways we can work with these built-in features. But hopefully this video will get you started just getting your feet wet with familiarizing with the basic functions within this widget. All right, thanks.